Hello. We are very sorry there was a technical issue with Microsoft Teams. It generated a bad link. We are obviously going to keep answering. We're going to be here for answering questions on this new link. We are also going to have a another info session that we'll schedule for next Tuesday at 5:30. Given that people will probably come in periodically, we're going to not do a presentation on the background to start, but rather go right into question and answer. If that is not what you're looking for, the one that we'll have next Tuesday at 5:30, we'll start with a kind of a half hour of presentation before going into Q&A. So if you have questions, you can put them in at any time in the Q&A button. And you can also, if you see ones you like, you can give thumbs ups to other people's questions and we'll go through them that way.
And for Brennan, we ought to introduce ourselves just
That's
briefly.
A great idea.
The folks who are arriving. I'm Michael Hubner. I'm the Long Range Planning Manager in the Office of Planning and Community Development. Heartfelt apologies. It's so frustrating when this happens for everybody involved. We're sorry about the technical difficulties. Glad you're able to stick it out and get your questions in here. But we'll replicate next Tuesday what we would have done tonight. And Brennan, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Brennan Staley. I'm the Strategic Advisor in the Office of Planning and Community Development, and I'm the project lead for the zoning update portion of this work. So it appears we only have one question that is about what's going on right now. The link now says that the live event hasn't started, but it should have started now. So if anybody else has any questions, please put them in the Q&A function. We're happy to talk. I'll just say that, and from my side, it doesn't show. It just has the staff in the meeting. It doesn't show anybody else. Okay, we have a question. And the first question is, what criteria was used to determine when to convert an existing low-rise or neighborhood residential zone to neighborhood commercial? There's a single lot on 10th Avenue West in Queen Anne that is currently LR1 and proposed to be neighborhood commercial. Why this single lot? So in general, we didn't rezone many areas from multifamily zone, or sorry, residential zones like low-rise or neighborhood residential to neighborhood commercial. There are some areas in neighborhood centers where there was a feeling that there was a very limited amount of space that could have commercial properties, that are kind of really encouraged in those areas, and so we did consider them. I do not know about this single one on 10th Avenue West, but maybe I can look into that as Michael asks a question. Michael, do you want to take the next one? It says, how likely are we?
Yeah, I can't see the question, so you'll have to read it to me.
How likely are we to see some of the proposed LR3 zoning be upzoned to commercial as part of phase 3?
So first, let me describe what phase 3 will entail. So a lot of this is each of the phases relates to different parts of the city, geographically different parts of the city. Phase 3 is exclusively going to be looking at land within the existing Seattle plan or the urban villages and within the urban centers in our existing plan, and making zoning changes primarily with the goal and objective of adding additional housing capacity within those centers, mainly by looking at a zoning that would allow taller buildings, especially and including around some of our major transit investments like new light rails, existing and new light rail stations, bus rapid transit, and just generally looking at opportunities to provide more housing capacity in the centers. Some of those existing zoning in those centers may be low-rise 3. It's possible that we may look at neighborhood commercial as a zone that change is made to. However, that's not really because neighborhood commercial is a mixed use zone. It allows both residential and then typically commercial on the ground floor. It wouldn't be a major emphasis of that work, but it's certainly among the zones that we might use. And the low-rise 3 outside of the centers, we wouldn't be looking at changing the low-rise 3 outside of the centers as part of phase 3. The proposal you see that's out for public comment right now includes all of the changes in those areas outside of the center. So it kind of depends on what part of the city you're looking at.
And just go back to the earlier question, looking at that is an unusual site. I don't know why we don't see many things like that happening in other areas of the city. My only guess is that either it was an error or there's the two parcels are kind of a common ownership, and so there was an effort to kind of not have a lot the zoning split across something of common ownership. But we'll certainly look into that one.
Well, and Brennan, if I could add for the questioner here, it sounds like the questioner has some interest or knows that property well. If you want to send us a comment about that, the changes you see it there and what you think might be appropriate on the site, we would welcome that comment as well. We take a look at that.
Great. The next question is, why are there areas that are surrounded by frequent transit, but the new zoning, mostly LR3, is limited to 1 block from the transit corridors? For example, the Ravenna or Bryant neighborhoods. I'm struggling to figure out what exactly the context of this is. I mean, maybe stepping up for a second, the rezones that we're proposing are in the entirety of those areas that are designated as neighborhood centers, and also limited parcels that are on both sides of or that are along frequent transit routes. So, it may be that, the reason it's limited in size is because it's along a frequent transit route, and we're doing primarily those properties that are abutting a frequent transit route, or, or within 100 feet of them. Or it could be that maybe there are two areas, maybe an area that is between a neighborhood center and an urban center, and they're not in those centers though.
Brennan, I think if you don't mind, I think the question may have been, you may want to take a look at the wording again. I can't see the question is, why is the rezone proposal along the frequent transit arterials? Why does it only extend 1 parcel deep on either side of those roadways, as opposed to wider?
I guess the answer there is that there's an effort to kind of balance the amount of change that was happening along those frequent transit routes, and that the width that is proposed is a balance between allowing more housing along frequent transit routes and also limiting the extent of changes in the adjacent neighborhoods. But if that doesn't answer your question, please feel free to rephrase it. And Michael, you can see the questions by hitting the Q&A button up top.
Thank you, Brennan. We're all a little discombobulated with our technical difficulties tonight. So,
yeah. So the next question is about the boundary, what it's in phase 2 and phase 3. So phase 2 has changes to the expansion areas of urban centers. So there are certain urban and regional centers that we're proposing to expand. Those are being expanded for a couple of reasons. One, places where there's new light rail stations. There's a couple urban centers that are very small and don't meet the kind of basic standards that we have or the county has for countywide centers. And then there's also Squire Park, which is the area that is surrounded on all sides by existing centers. So we are, as part of phase 2, proposing changes for those places that are being expanded. And we're also obviously a part of this work updating neighborhood residential zones, and one of those, and so any areas that have neighborhood residential zones in side of urban centers are being updated, and specifically that RSL zone is going away, and so those are being changed to low rise 1, which is the closest zone in terms of average density.
And Brendan, to put a fine point on it, the last part of this question here, I think the answer is no. We're not saying that parcels that are being rezoned as part of phase 2, categorically they would not be looked at as part of phase 3. There are some parcels, as Brendan noted, within urban centers, urban villages that are proposed for rezones, and they have very particular reasons related to the phase 2 part of the work. But within the centers in phase 3, some of those may be proposed for further zoning change at that time. But we're going to take that question on as part of a more comprehensive look at the role and the housing needs in each of those centers. That's not what we're doing now. This is mainly about the expansions and the change from RSL to low rise and a couple of other more tangential issues to the centers. The bigger change will be in phase 3.
Great. Now, so there's a comment as well that we should postpone the end of the phase 2 until after phase 3 is complete. Next question, does the revised zoning for the One Seattle plan do anything to address the affordability of small commercial spaces and to prevent new development from displacing small, local, and family-owned businesses in our neighborhoods and urban centers? How do we ensure that there is diversity of not just housing, but also commercial spaces in our neighborhoods? So the, I don't know if Michael, if you want to start with the One Seattle plan and what it does on those types of things, or
no. Why don't you start? I think you're Go
Great.
ahead and carry the ball. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of the zoning, obviously there are is already a lot of existing commercial zoning in most of the centers that we're doing. As we mentioned previously, we're not looking at significantly expanding the area of neighborhood commercial zoning. However, there are some places where we're looking at expanding that could create more opportunities, more space for businesses. We also, as part of the neighborhood residential and low-rise changes, we are proposing to allow corner stores in throughout those areas. Those could help to provide spaces for both new businesses as well as existing businesses that are looking for smaller spaces or less expensive spaces, potentially to locate their businesses there. In terms of those kind of more the neighborhood business districts that are in the middle of some of these centers, there is some trade-offs there. Obviously, there could be more likely to have redevelopment in those areas where we are proposing upzones. We're also proposing, though the majority of our changes actually are kind of around those centers to provide more housing. So as there is more people there, that provides a bigger market, and so that can help to provide more revenue for those businesses. As new commercial neighborhood commercial places are redeveloped, that also will tend to result in some new commercial spaces. Obviously, some of that is replacement, some of that is new, and those spaces could be used by those businesses as well. Then how do we ensure there's a diversity of not just housing and commercial spaces in neighborhoods? That is a pretty complicated question. I mean, obviously, I think the core of it is zoning for providing enough zoning so that there's plenty of commercial space as places are redeveloped. We do also have some requirements about kind of the size of commercial spaces, and we also have pedestrian requirements in certain places that actually require more retail to ground floor, so that helps to kind of create that diversity of spaces. within the neighborhood. Yeah. Will a recording of tonight's event be made public? Yes, that is the plan. As with the other ones, we've been recording them and making them public. Next question, I'll hand this to Michael. I noticed there are very few changes to zoning around parks, such as Gasworks, Washington Arboretum, and Seward Park. Did you look at rezoning areas around parks to give more people access to living near those spaces?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Certainly, parks are a really important amenity, and for a range of reasons to be near where we are planning for housing in the city, and in designating our neighborhood centers and in planning for investments in areas of the city where we anticipate growth. Certainly, providing open space and parks is an important part of making the city and its neighborhoods livable. We did study the option of increasing zoning density specifically around some of the larger parks in the city. That was one of the options that we looked at in our environmental impact statement. The proposal that the mayor's recommended growth strategy and the zoning proposal that you're looking at this fall focused primarily on our transit proximate development, so along the frequent transit routes in and around our existing centers, along the transit arterials. The neighborhood centers themselves are primarily located because of the existence of commercial core and connection to our frequent transit network. And in some cases, they do have excellent parks, small to mid-sized parks nearby. But it was those really are the priority in this growth strategy vision that's been released by the mayor. And we think that there are locations on the map that you see in the growth strategy which do provide access to parks, and that's a side benefit, but it's not a major thrust of this proposal. You're on mute, Brennan.
The next question says, what about step zoning? So you don't go from 0 to 5 stories on these extremely small side streets. Yeah, so I think that the basic idea is, could we consider having zoning that changes between blocks so that it steps up? And obviously from the 3 stories that you have in neighborhood residential, maybe that'd be a 4-story zone to 5 stories. There is a balance there. That is actually what you see a lot in urban centers, which are very large and so kind of allow for a lot more transition. In the new neighborhood centers, they're much smaller areas, often just 1 or 2 blocks. And so, providing for that transition might then involve, expanding them to allow for more of that transition. And so I guess there's a balance there between, affecting more areas versus having, a smaller thing and less transition. Overall, we have tried to put those transitions across streets so that there is, that 60 to 80 foot right of way between zones. And I think it's also important to know, kind of in this balance, today we mostly see our 4-story zones are still townhouse zones, and so that it really is when you get to 5 stories that you actually have kind of a likelihood of starting to get more apartment buildings. And so I think that's another thing that was considered in the proposal. So the next question is, I'll let Michael handle this. How are you guys working with the Department of Transportation regarding the rezoning? Specifically, the Magnolia Bridge has been an issue and there's still no resolution to make it earthquake safe. If alternative routes are used, Southeast Magnolia no longer is walkable to Seattle, nor on the major bus route.
Yeah. So we have worked very closely with Seattle Department of Transportation, SDOT. You may be aware that SDOT recently completed their own long-range plan for the transportation system for investments in the city called the Seattle Transportation Plan. And of course, the residents of Seattle just approved a major levy for transportation improvements. This was really a great opportunity for us to work more closely with SDOT for this particular comp plan update. Both of these are long-range plans. This is a long-range comprehensive plan looking at 20 years and even in some cases beyond that, and considering our long-term housing needs. For that reason, there are transportation needs in many parts of the city that we certainly are aware of and cognizant of in crafting the growth strategy. The Magnolia Bridge is one of them. But for our long-range vision for the city, there's still going to be a role for the neighborhood of Magnolia for accommodating some of our housing need. I would say, if you look at the citywide map, the 2 neighborhood centers that are proposed for Magnolia, and then of course the changes to neighborhood residential, which are citywide in any case, it's not a significant, in that citywide context, a significant amount of residential growth that we're counting on Magnolia to accommodate over the next 20 years. It is a change, but all neighborhoods have change, and we understand that, God forbid there's bridges disruption due to an earthquake or other issue, that would eventually resolve itself. It would be something that would be repaired and provide access to Magnolia. So it's not a prohibitive factor for us not planning for growth in the Magnolia neighborhood. But I think the larger context is it's not, we don't have a major urban center planned in that area. These are more incremental changes for Magnolia to play its part.
Great. The next question, I applaud trying to upzone around areas of high transit use, but what's the threshold for that? In some cases, there are roads that are currently single family zoned with a single bus route that runs every 30 to 45 minutes that are labeled as a corridor and rezoned to low-rise 3. So for the rezoning along frequent transit routes, the criteria for that is we use a definition of frequent transit route, which actually is in the code today. If you go to our FAQ document, which is on the engagement tab on our website, it has the detailed definition, but in general, those are just sites that on weekdays from 6 a.m. to 7 p.m. have 15-minute buses coming every 15 minutes. There's also a standard for weekends and for nights, which is around 30 minutes on average. So those are the ones that account as frequent transit routes and have those those rezones. The next question, it says, where can I get more information on the new stacked flats? So in terms of the development standards that they would be required to meet, we have on our website a document both that talks about the development standards in low-rise zones as well as that talks about the mid-rise zones. You can find that by going to the website, going to the engagement tab again, and it's called low-rise development standards and mid-rise development standards. And so those kind of both show the development standards and have some images of what development might look like in those zones.
Brennan, can you say something about stacked flats in the neighborhood residential?
Thank you. Yeah, so as part of the state law HB 1110 that requires us to update our what they call single family zones, which is in this case neighborhood residential, we are required to allow a wide variety of housing types. So stacked flats would be allowed in all neighborhood residential zones, and we also are proposing a bonus. So on lots that are at least 6,000 square feet and are located within a quarter mile of a frequent transit route, if you do a stacked flat, it could be slightly more floor area, slightly denser, still within that 3-story height limit. We have, however, done economic modeling around that, and it does suggest that that is not likely to be a viable product in the short term. So it might be in the future, we might be likely to see that in neighborhood residential zones, but really probably in the short term, we're likely to see it in kind of our 5- and 6-story zones primarily. So the next question is, how are you planning this from a topographical point of view when rezoning for accessibility? I'm not sure I understand that question, but I will talk maybe just a little bit about accessibility and how that fits into this. We The major way we get new units that are accessible are in stacked flats. Both, obviously in the ground floor of all those units, on the ground floor of those buildings, they are all required to be accessible. If there are elevators, a portion of units on those floors accessible by elevators are required to be accessible as well. So a portion of all units in stacked flat buildings are required to be accessible. And so we are trying to encourage more of that, again, both through the changes in neighborhood residential generally, but also the stacked flat bonus in that zone, as well as creating more zoning for buildings that could be apartments and condos that would have those accessible units integrated into them. And that obviously is being done through the rezones to neighborhood centers and frequent transit routes, et cetera.
And Brennan, I'm going to take a stab at this too, because it could be, I suspect that the questioner may be wondering about slopes and hilly topography and where the zoning changes are applied with respect to that feature. Slope and topography is certainly one of the factors that we looked at in determining the boundaries of our proposed neighborhood centers and the expansion areas, shaping the new zoning that you see on the map. It was only one of a number of factors that we looked at, so not prohibitive certainly, but something we took into account. Walkability for the neighborhood centers is important, but of course Seattle's a hilly city, and we didn't avoid all slopes and hills, but took that into account when delineating the areas that are planned for new growth.
Great. The next one seems to be a comment that the floor area ratio seems to yield strange results. I'm afraid I don't really understand the question. So maybe if you could either send an email with more information or try and reframe it, that would be helpful. The next is a city proposing that there will be an option to pay an in lieu of fee in the neighborhood residential zones. And if not, has the city been hearing proposals that there be a option to pay an in lieu fee? Well, I guess there's a couple. I guess really the only place we have something that is a kind of in lieu fee is under tree regulations. That under our tree protection regulations, if trees, in those cases where trees can be removed as part of development, there's a requirement to either provide those trees on site or pay into a fund to do trees off site. We've not been hearing any options of changing that.
Brennan, this could be, and again, we'll do our best to address what we think where the questions are coming from. This could be a question about MHA, mandatory housing affordability, which for many areas in the city that have been rezoned in recent years is applied where a new upzoned areas, new projects in those areas either must include affordable units or pay a fee into a fund that helps to create those units on another site as affordable at below market rate. For neighborhood residential, the proposal is not to have an MHA requirement in neighborhood residential. So if you're asking about the MHA in NR, the answer is no, there's no in lieu fee, there's no MHA requirement at all that's being proposed.
Next question is, how is the maximum height measured? Specifically when a lot is on a slope, if the maximum height of the zone is 30 feet, what is the 30 feet measured from? So the measurement of height is based on an average slope. And so if you have, if you're there's a low end and a high end, you take and you're doing the height across the entirety, it'd be the middle of that. And it is based on measured from what I call the finished or the existing or finished grade. So it's the higher of either what it was previously or if any grading is going on during the development of what that would be. There are provisions though for kind of for longer ones, you can split that up. So then maybe half of it would be measured from the average, the height on that. The other half would be measured on the average height of that of the other half. So the next question is why, I'll let Michael handle this one. Why are you planning for neighborhood centers that are not a 15-minute walk from a grocery store?
Right. Okay. Sorry, I had to. There was the negative, the not 15-minute walk. So a grocery store is an important neighborhood amenity for sure. We recognize that, and certainly there are neighborhood commercial areas around which that have grocery stores that we are proposing a neighborhood center. But there's a whole list of stores and public amenities that meet people's everyday needs, and we did not set a criterion that each neighborhood center would include all of them, but rather that there be a core non-residential area with stores and perhaps in some cases also public amenities like post offices or libraries or other. We certainly tried to pick up most of the grocery store locations where they were appropriate for that neighborhood center, but also other areas that had a different mix of uses that we think will also function well in allowing people to live near what they need and use every day. And we hope that and I think the question about retail space that was asked before, as Brennan was noting, we hope that by adding housing options around the existing retail cores in our neighborhoods, that can help to support additional retail that sells food and healthy food, produce, groceries at a small, medium, or larger scale. So these work hand in hand, and it certainly wasn't a must-have grocery store criterion that we applied.
Next question says, if you know that stack flats in NR zones don't pencil, or our economic analysis suggests that it won't, why not adjust the FAR or coverage requirements to make them more economical? I guess I'll first say, obviously we're looking for public engagement, for feedback right now. If you think there are changes that would help to do that, that's a very legitimate comment. I think generally, probably it's not simply a matter of tweaking FAR or coverage to make them more economical. It probably really is rather increasing the height, and obviously if we're increasing the height substantially, that's really more like a rezone to a different zone rather than a tweaked FAR. And so obviously that our approach is to actually try and create a lot more space for apartments and condos, but those are primarily in those areas where we're doing a full rezone, such as neighborhood centers along frequent transit routes and in center expansions.
And Brennan, I'll add to that too, is I wouldn't go so far as to say we have concluded we're not going to see stack flats. This is going new zone. These are new provisions in code. We are hoping to get a range of development types in neighborhood residential, including stack flats, especially near transit. And there are different provisions in place in different parts of the city that will help to make projects pencil or not. For example, under House Bill 1110, there are parts of the city and neighborhood residential where there will not be a parking requirement. For example, there is potential state legislation related to condominium liability that might, if some of those state level issues are resolved, might result in lower costs for development of flats and other things that might change. We feel like within that height sort of scale of development in neighborhood residential, which is that 3-story, that we're doing what we can to provide a land use incentive as part of the picture that'll help stack flats be a more economically viable development type. And it's consistent with state law too, which is we should be welcoming stack flats where they can be built. And we'll see what happens over the next several years of implementing this plan and the zoning, and could potentially make adjustments based on what gets built and what doesn't get built, and feedback from the development community.
The next question is, are there any reason why there are some gaps between urban centers and upzoning on frequent transit routes? Example, in Northgate, there's a gap between the center and low-rise 3 zoning. And I think the answer is obviously the criteria for urban centers, such as Northgate is actually a regional center, or supposed to be and we're not proposing to change the zoning of places like Northgate at this point. So that boundary is kind of what it is today. And the rezones we're proposing along frequent transit routes are limited in size, and so that might, in some cases, result in gaps. If there are places where you think that the zoning should change, please let us know about that. And obviously, as part of phase 3, we're going to be looking at places like Northgate and Regional Center, and so that could also be an opportunity to kind of think about if there's small tweaks to the boundary of a place like Northgate that might make sense. The next one I'll give to Michael. Given the amount of new units possible with the first and second rezones, which I guess, which we're talking about right now, the rezone of the urban villages might be significant to make any sense. So I think basically the idea they're saying we're doing rezones now. There will be phase 3. There will be additional ones in the future. Will we allow mid-rise or high-rise in what are urban villages today? And if so, will they extend to the proposed urban village extensions? That were sort of
Yeah, and Brandon, we might want to tag team on this a little bit, but I'll start. I'm going to start with the extensions part, our approach to the extensions. Our intent with the proposal for the rezones within the extended areas is to apply zoning in those locations, which is fits the definition of a range of heights and densities that would be in an urban center or a regional center, because there are extensions on both of those. And to essentially make the proposed zoning that is going to be appropriate over the long term, also cognizant of the fact that there will be likely zoning changes within the existing boundary of that center. So we have that in mind in putting the proposal out now, and I would say it is unlikely that there might be some very minor changes around the edges, especially where the current boundary and the extensions meet, where we might consider making changes to the proposal that is out for review right now. But primarily, we're going to be focused at the area within the existing boundaries, and not make additional major changes in the areas where we're making expansions. We are aware that there will be a third round, but putting the phase 2 out there in a way that anticipates that.
And then maybe I'll get the other half of that, is that could we allow MR or HR in what are urban villages today? We do not have kind of a currently scope for phase 3. So we don't, there's no proposal to do that or not to. Certainly looking at things like mid-rise around light rail stations, or even high-rise in limited areas, could be the kind of thing that could be considered as part of that work. So the next one is a clarification of a previous question. The in lieu question is about subsidized housing. And we are proposing to allow more to be built if some are subsidized. Are people proposing to opt out of actually subsidizing by paying a fee? I'm guessing this has to do with, so since we did not have MHA in neighborhood residential zones, this is about the affordable housing bonus. So we're currently proposing that within a quarter mile of frequent transit routes, that if half the units are set aside as affordable, that you could have additional height and floor area. So for those would actually have to be on-site units, and they would have a covenant, so it'd be at least 50 years. They would be rent and income restricted. And so no, those are not something that could be paid through a fee. Important to note, given the high level, this is also something we wouldn't expect that market rate developers would do, but rather, these have been nonprofit housing providers that would be holding on to these for the long term.
And in many, we anticipate really most cases, the percentage of affordable units would be significantly more than the 50% floor. I will, just for completeness of answer, this and another much smaller incentive that's required under state law, where we would allow 6 units on the lot if 2 were affordable. Similarly, there is no in lieu fee, which is part of that requirement. Those affordable units would have to be on that site.
Next, what is the reasoning behind requiring stores in neighborhood residential zones to be on corner lots? What about lots that are next to alleys? Does that count as a corner lot? So first, the simple one, no, a lot that is next to an alley doesn't necessarily count as a corner unless it's also on a corner. The rationale is that, as we hear about this, there's a lot of interest in having more opportunities for people to walk to local stores and restaurants, but there can also be conflicts with neighbors. The idea of limiting to the corner stores to corner lots, obviously those are often the ones that are most desirable as locations, but more specifically, corner lots tend to have less impact with neighbors, as if you're on a corner, you're adjacent to 2 properties rather than if you're in the middle, potentially 5. They also have better access to the street, so it can be, delivery and other things can be accomplished all on that street front. It's also a way of kind of limiting the separating these uses somewhat, so you don't have kind of whole streets that are have corner stores on them. So those were the rationales. Obviously, we're looking for feedback on whether that was the right approach or not. Next question, what changes are part of phase 1 and what changes are part of phase 2? And what is the timing for implementation of both these phases? Okay, so phase 1 is the comprehensive update of our neighborhood residential zones, plus changes to comply with various state laws that have deadlines in the middle of 2025. Those include the change about design standards, which require that design standards must be clear and objective. And so we're proposing to update our design standards. It also is a number of changes that are required to meet HB 1110 requirement that we can't have more restrictive requirements for attached units or stacked units than we have for detached. That means we need to change a bunch of our standards to do that. There's also a bill on parking that is requiring changes to parking. And so all those are included in phase 1.
Accessory dwelling units as well. Brennan.
Thank you.
House Bill 1337. And to be clear on the House Bill 1110, and just for folks who are really not, that's the bill that requires that the city allow at least 4 units on each lot, where currently we have neighborhood residential zoning, the variety of middle housing types that we've been talking about, stacked flats, townhomes, duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, and there are some other requirements in that bill as well, just for clarity. Yeah, but keep going.
Yeah, so phase 2 then are all the rezones that are happening in neighborhood centers, along frequent transit routes, and in the center expansions, as well as some additional changes to development standards for low-rise zones and mid-rise zones that are intended to make it easier to build apartments in those zones and to address some existing issues that we have in those codes. So those are the 2 phases. Obviously, the materials that we have out cover both phase 1 and phase 2. Both the kind of summary of the proposals and the legislation that we're proposing are out for the public. So they have the same public comment period, which we're in the middle of now and ends December 20th. But then in order to try and get the council to approve changes that are necessary to meet the state laws that have deadlines in the middle of 2025, we're proposing to send those to council in 2 phases. So the phase 1 legislation would go to council in March of 2025. They hope to adopt it in May or June of 2025. And then they'll probably be effective 60 days after that adoption date. And so that's when people can submit building permits to build under those rules. In terms of phase 2, we're planning on submitting that in May of 2025 so that council can take it up right after they pass phase 1 legislation. They expect that then they might be able to adopt it by September of 2025. That would have a longer effective date period, so it would likely be early 2026 before people could build under those codes. Next question, could you please explain how you would plan to support 5-story development in Upper Queen Anne if there's no plan to support more expanded roadways? I guess you're probably thinking then specifically about the transportation impacts of a 5-story development. I guess there's the wide variety of things that can happen there. Obviously, we would expect a lot of that development would provide parking on site, other maybe not one-to-one. So there'd be some parking on site. Other people might have a vehicle that would park on the street, or they would choose to live without a car and would use transit. We were certainly correct. We're not planning to expand roadways in Queen Anne, nor really are there plans to do that throughout the city. And so the ways that we are working to deal with more people living here is to have a wider variety of transportation options. And so obviously those include expanding our transit options, both the creation of the light rail system, and then also gradually increasing transit as more people arrive. Metro and the city work together on planning for that, and over time we've substantially increased the amount of transit that's been there as our population increases. The Seattle Department of Transportation has their own transportation plan, which also looks at other options for increasing the pedestrian network and making it easier and safer to bike throughout the city as well. The next question says, can you explain how neighborhood center boundaries were determined? For example, Montlake has a gap between 520 and the northern boundary. Also, the overall area in Montlake looks to be greater than neighborhoods comparable or bigger neighborhoods, for example, to Madrona or Madison Park. So the ways that we determine the neighborhood center boundaries is that for each of them we started, there's obviously we set the center usually in the middle of the business district, or if there wasn't a clear set of the business district where a major transit stop was. And from that, we started with a walkshed analysis, and we basically selected all the blocks in which more than half of them were within a 4-minute walk of that center point. That is generally consistent with about 1,000 feet of walking, and that model runs along streets, so it is based on the street network where you can actually walk. And it also took topography into account. So in areas that are steeper, the areas were a little bit smaller. Then we had city staff went actually out and both looked at information about environmentally critical areas and wide variety of other factors, and then actually walked these areas to understand slope and things like that. And so there were some changes made to consider local conditions. So in general, all of the neighborhood centers are of a fairly similar size, but they do vary, again, both because of the connectivity of neighborhoods, the things like there might be steep slopes or ECAs and things were removed. Often if you look at a map, they do somewhat look differently because there are some that have much smaller blocks and larger blocks. Maple Leaf has very long blocks, and so it's only 1 block wide, whereas a place like Montlake has smaller blocks, and so it is looks very different. But they started from a place of being kind of generally similar in size. Okay, great. There's a question. How can we find the recorded sessions online of these? So if you go to the place where you found the link to this event, that will be removed after this, and in its place will be the recording. And obviously, if you go to the previous virtual open house that already has that recording is online. Okay, so there is a reclarification question here. Your proposal allows much more floor area if density is 1 per 2,200, then 1 per 2,201, contrary to the overall trend of the proposal. So a 1 unit per 2021, 1 unit per 2,201 square feet is less dense than 1 unit per 2,200 square feet. And that was the intent. So the idea is for parcels with fewer units, that they have a lower floor area. So if you think about this on a 5,000 square foot lot, if you have only 1 unit, it would have a FAR of 0.6, which is 3,000 square feet. If you have 2 units, then it would be 0.8, which would be about 4,000 square feet, and then it goes up to 5,000 and 6,000. So the idea is that the more units they have, the more square foot overall you're allowed, but because it's only incremental, the per unit threshold would be smaller. So you're again getting more floor area if you have more units, but but the per unit it would be smaller on average.
And Brendan, maybe taking a step back to just talk about the principle there that we're trying to apply, which is we want to both incentivize and accommodate developments that are providing more housing. So if it's a 4-unit development, make sure that enough building space is provided to reasonably accommodate 4 units. And we certainly don't want to, it's not the city's goal to see a single home. If someone's building 1 home, that it be the size of 4 townhomes, be a very large single house. That's not consistent with our goals to provide more housing and a range of housing types and more affordable housing. So this ramped up floor area ratio, depending on the number of units that are provided, is a way to do both of those things.
And maybe just get the last one. We're certainly not proposing any changes to this proposal between now and next Tuesday. We're in a listening mode right now, and so we're going to wait until we all get all the comments, and then we'll consider them and consider changes. How much emphasis is being made to increase affordable housing in any existing or new proposed zoning code area? I would like to see an ordinance that mandates a percentage of any existing or new housing go to all income groups, even the homeless with 0 income. So our proposal, so first of all, I would say this from the city's perspective, we only call something affordable housing if it has a covenant so that it has a the price is set and that it's reserved for people who are low income. So if you're interested in also just how we're trying to make more affordable housing generally, that might be a different thing. But in terms of those types of units, this proposal would help in that in a couple different ways. One, currently builders of affordable housing struggle often to find land that they can develop that is at a price that they can afford. And so we're creating a lot more supply of those types of sites. So we're making it easier for affordable housing providers to find sites and reducing the competition for those kind of limited ones that currently exist. 2, in all the areas that are being rezoned from neighborhood residential to something else, we're proposing to require mandatory housing affordability, which does require that either a portion of units have to be set aside in the project or that money has to be paid so we can provide that to nonprofit builders to build those. And so that will require mandatory housing affordability in a much greater area of the city. To the extent that we're proposing larger increases, those MHA requirements will increase as well. So the requirements for MHA will be higher in those areas that got a bigger rezone. In terms of requiring a percentage of units in existing homes, that is probably not something that the city could legally do for a variety of reasons. The next question. I live in an area that is currently zoned neighborhood residential and is proposed to change to LR3. The maximum permissible size of an ADU is actually going down as a result of this change from 1,000 square feet to 650 square feet, why are the limits for ADUs in LR smaller than NR? So I think that there's some confusion about this. The size limit for ADUs will remain at 1,000 square feet. I think there is a provision in the code that says that ADUs are exempt from density limits if they are in the first floor of a building and are no more than 600 square feet. And the idea being there that if you're building a townhouse, we want to make it easy for people to potentially rent out the first floor of their townhouse, and that's why we would allow an ADU to be in that first floor. However, you're still allowed to have accessory dwelling units that are 1,000 square feet. They just wouldn't be exempt from the density limit. Next question, a specific follow-up to the max height measurement question. There are lots that sit halfway along a sloped street that runs east-west, but are not directly on either avenue. One such lot is already built such that the entry level is about 20 feet above the lower avenue. If it gets upzoned to LR3, while NR stays, while the NR side stays, the ninth side stays NR, is the 50-foot max height determined by the average slope of the east-west street between those two? Okay, so first, just talking about how height is measured. Height is measured, it's the average from whatever the front of the structure is to the back of the structure. So it doesn't, so it's based on where the building is located, not the street level on either side.
Brendan, I'm sorry to interrupt. Do you mean the front to the back of the lot?
No, it's the front of the building to the back of the building.
Okay, sorry, I'm sorry. Keep going.
So you don't get different height limits based on So it's based on where it's located on that lot, and it's measured from the grade at that one end of the building to the grade at the other end of the building. I think though your question is also getting at what happens if zoning is split. Overall, for the substantial majority of the proposal, we're trying to make the zoning the same on blocks so that it is one height limit. And so basically the entire block would either be LR3 or NR, and so there would be one height limit for that parcel.
Brennan, I'm sorry, it's a complicated question. I think that this looks like we may be talking about up on Queen Anne. This is, I believe, along a frequent transit arterial, so it's not a full block upzone, but rather just the lots facing the arterial. So there is these are blocks with two different zoning designations on them.
That's right. Yeah, along frequent transit, there is that transition there.
Yes.
But again, so the properties themselves, each property has its own zoning, so it would be based on whatever that property is zoned. Yeah. Thank you, Michael. With the demise of department store and the rise of online shopping, Main Street activity inside malls has decreased or stopped. Is there any desire to recreate the Main Street shopping experience in urban villages centers that are not strip malls? Let's read this again one more time. Unless, Michael, you have a thought here.
Yes, I mean, it is definitely a goal of the city to support vibrant retail neighborhoods, districts in the city. They include main streets, arterials, existing commercial zoning, and really vibrant and economically successful small and larger businesses in our neighborhoods. So we are zoning. There are certainly, you're talking about here as opposed to strip mall is one scenario where you might have retail, which is a little bit more auto oriented, or a mall like Northgate, when we still have the Northgate gate covered mall in North Seattle, is a different retail scenario. We are moving toward and helping to support with our zoning changes a street level retail experience that is oriented toward the street, toward public interface with stores and businesses and amenities. We have neighborhood, we have pedestrian overlays in some areas that accompany our zoning. We have neighborhood commercial zoning, which has ground floor retail requirements associated with it that helps to support exactly what you're talking about when new development occurs. And our Department of Economic Development at the city certainly does a lot of work to help support small businesses in neighborhoods and business districts across the city to make sure that they stay in business and we don't have empty storefronts that are create dead space along the street and just overall don't meet people's needs. So we're trying to do all of those things, and yes, I would say broadly it's a goal of the city, and there are parts of the zoning proposal that we think will help to support that goal as well.
Michael, one for you. Will more effort be placed going forward into communicating how long-term of a plan this is? I'm aware it says on the plan, but some of the comments seem to respond if it is the neighborhood changes might happen overnight.
Right. Well, it's a 20-year plan by definition. I'll just say that first off, we as comprehensive plans are, as a matter of state law, is that we are required to have a 20-year comprehensive plan. That's a pretty long time for growth and development. It's certainly longer than the next several years and what might happen through this economic cycle of, I mean, in the city, we tend to see growth goes up and down, both in terms of certainly employment and new housing development. And the comprehensive plan is intended to set a longer term vision that's not just about what's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years, but over a much longer time frame. And with that in mind, and looking even beyond the 20-year time frame, because we want to set a vision and adopt regulations that can accommodate a future that we may not be able to foresee as clearly as we might want to. We might grow faster in the next 20 years. We might find ourselves after 20 years, in another housing crisis that extends even beyond the 20 years. Is that what we're trying to do with this plan is provide new opportunity on both sites and capacity on those sites, building height and the size of new residential development to meet our housing needs. And it's definitely not going to happen all at once. The changes that have been released for public comment this fall affect neighborhoods across the city. It really is a very large geographic area, be it the new middle housing zoning in our neighborhood residential or the new opportunities to develop up more apartment scale along transit arterials or in our centers. There are many locations across the city, and for that reason, we don't expect that any one or several of them will see all of the real focused development activity in the short term. It will be more distributed across different neighborhoods, and it will take place over time. For example, in our neighborhood residential areas, some of the results from some of the economic modeling we've been looking at suggest that not all neighborhood residential single family lots are going to be economically feasible to build a fourplex on. In fact, most will not in the short to medium term. Some will be more profitable to develop, and we may be looking at something more in the 10 or 15 or 20% of lots that may redevelop over the next 10 plus years. And we really don't know what that rate is going to be, but we do know that it'll be spread across multiple neighborhoods and therefore be a very incremental change. There will be some neighborhoods that change more than others. We know that, but zoning is not going to channel all of the development into just one or several neighborhoods. Every neighborhood is going to play their part.
Great. The next question says, is there a reason that no upzoning was proposed in the Montlake area right across from the UW light rail station and a recently covered SR 520 lid? It's flat and near major transit space, school, and hospital. So the proposal that we came forward with was to have a new neighborhood center at in Montlake, but as we talked about, previously, those are that for all the neighborhood centers are kind of based on the center of a neighborhood business district, and in that it starts like within the included areas that are within a 4-minute walk of that, and basically that area is significantly farther than a reasonable walk shed from that neighborhood center. We're also not at this point proposing to change the boundaries of the existing U District Regional Center, which is what that is already contains, that UW light rail station. Sorry, what are stacked flats? Can you give me a simple description? Yeah, my apologies that probably not using terms that are simple. A stacked flat simply means apartments or condos. So we often make the distinction between stacked flats, which are units that are stacked above each other, and attached units, which are owned from floor to the top, all by one person, and just share a wall with another unit next to them. But stacked flats are essentially apartments and condos.
Yes, one on top of the other, and usually each is just a single level. So the stacked flats also don't have interior stairs. Your entire living unit is on one level, which is an important characteristic of stacked flats that meet household needs that are not necessarily met by, for example, townhomes. Older people, people with disabilities, even families with young kids. So it's an important part of our housing mix.
There was just a question about ways to submit. If you have a long form that you want to submit, and you can send that by email as well, and Aja put that in the question here. The next question is, what does it mean to ask for 80% lot coverage? Verbia says lot coverage is 50%, but you can ask for 80. I think there's some confusion. The lot coverage is 50% there is in neighborhood residential zones. There's no provision where you can ask for 80% lot coverage. The next one is my street zoning is proposed to increase from neighborhood residential 3 to low rise 3. This seems abrupt and aggressive. Are there lots of areas when this is happening? So LR3 is the major zone that is through which things are being rezoned to in neighborhood centers and also along frequent transit routes. LR3 is a zone that allows 5-story apartment and condos. And the idea is that, as part of this proposal, we are trying to create more capacity for apartments and condos. There is, we don't have enough of that type of housing today, and we're expected to grow significantly over the future. And so we really want to make sure that there's a supply of that, but also that there are, apartment and condos in, every neighborhood of the city, so that people have real options for where they can live, especially, often as their needs change over time. Young people often need those because they can't afford to buy a home. Older people often want those because they can live on one floor rather than having to go up and down stairs. And so, and I'll just lastly say, 5 stories is the point where you can kind of justify the parking that's required in those areas. To fit the parking and build a building, you have to go underground, and five stories is the point which that starts to make sense. It doesn't often work with less than 5 stories, and so that's the idea, to kind of, these are areas where we're hoping to create some opportunities for apartments and condos.
And to answer the part of the question about, is this happening in a lot of areas, the answer is yes. For existing neighborhood residential parcels, the the new zone where there is a change in zoning for neighborhood residential is most commonly to low-rise 3. That is the most common change in neighborhood centers and the transit arterials. But overall, the vast majority of neighborhood residential is staying neighborhood residential.
Here's a question that, Michael, you can take this, or I'm happy to. Were the Seattle Fire Department and Seattle Police Department consulted to make sure there is adequate staffing to cover the proposed new density? Our precinct is already low on police, and there is concern about how the city would accommodate with a new density. I'm happy to take that. If you
No,
want to.
no, I can take that.
Great.
That's fine. Yeah, we worked closely with a number of departments across the city. It's quite frankly a requirement of what we do under the State's Growth Management Act in developing a comprehensive plan is that we have different chapters of the plan that address different aspects of what the city needs to do to plan for growth. One of those, for example, is capital facilities. Within and fire and police are two of those capital facilities, categories of services and facilities the city has to provide. And we met with those departments throughout the process. Will be an appendix to the plan itself, which talks about our police and fire facilities that exist now, that talks about staffing, that describes the coordination we do with them, and we share our information with them about where and how much growth we anticipate under this plan, so that when they're doing their facilities and staffing plans, they can anticipate that growth. So it's really a back and forth coordination with those departments. Again, back to the question about, is it all going to happen at once? It's certainly not it's not something that they will do, is that they will staff up to meet the amount of growth that's going to occur over a full 20 years and beyond, but rather they know some of the locations we're providing for more density. We will look at permitting trends. They'll look at things like response times and some of the metrics that they use to plan for service needs, and we'll work closely to make sure that all of our neighborhoods are well served as we grow. You're on mute, Brennan.
There's a follow-up question, and I'm afraid it still doesn't make any sense to me. I don't know what the 1 per and the 2,000 per unit are supposed to mean. So I'm afraid I still don't understand the question. There's also a question, zoning changes are being proposed for South Park. What zoning changes are being proposed for South Park given the smaller lots? And obviously, and then a comment also that they are concerned about the tree canopy in that area. South Park is proposed a couple things. One, we are changing its designation from what we call an urban center to a neighborhood center, which is actually kind of a lower designation. As part of that, we are also significantly reducing the size of the neighborhood center. Areas outside of that new center, which is the majority of them, are going to be rezoned to neighborhood residential, which is our lowest density zone. And so those, and then inside, there are changes that we would look at increasing zoning either to LR1 for most of it, or in some limited areas to LR3, which is an apartment zone. So again, yeah, significantly shrinking the size of that neighborhood center, neighborhood residential outside, and then a mix of townhouse and apartment zones within. I think that is all the questions we have. So if there are, we'll stay here for a little bit more. If there's more questions, we're happy to take them. And maybe just because people might start leaving, again, just a reminder that we're looking for public comments by next Friday, December 20th. And that this can be submitted on our website, zoning.oneseattleplan.com. Again, also, if they're longer, they can send to the email that we put forward. We again apologize for the technical difficulties, and we will plan to have a follow-up meeting next week. That will start with a presentation where we'll go over everything, and then have another question and answer session like this. Yeah. So, and again, if you do also have questions in the meantime, you can also use that email address to send us questions.
And Brandon, did you mention the office hours?
No, thank you. We also do have office hours. Those are also formats where people can come in. They're virtual meetings where people can come to ask questions. It's a good opportunity for kind of more detailed questions. We're having those on Monday. Let me see if I'll pull up the timing of that. So Monday from 9 to noon.
Yeah.
Monday the 16th.
And I know there was one or two questions here tonight where, in the open house format, and typically, if we hadn't had the technical snafu tonight, we might have had a large number of participants. So that's why we use the Q&A function here to do questions in writing. But if there were a couple of really detailed questions, we had a little bit of trouble understanding what the thrust of the question was or understanding the details. If you show up at the office hours, you can actually talk to us. We can have a conversation and maybe figure out exactly what information you're seeking to get. So if you had trouble getting the right answer tonight, just drop in on Monday morning and you can talk to one of the staff.
There's another question that is, recently there's been a ruling against the merging of grocery stores. How might that ruling change how grocery stores function? Probably from a land use perspective, not very much. I think grocery stores look at market area and they, kind of put stores based on that. Certainly having fewer grocery chains might mean we might have fewer grocery stores, and so if the merger might then result in more grocery stores, but that it's hard to guess. With the proposed added density, formerly single-family zones will be upzoned, their property tax will significantly increase. How do you propose to address this impact specifically for senior homeowners? So first, there's a question about, obviously places that are staying in neighborhood residential, because they represent the majority of the city, probably will not see significant changes in property taxes. For areas that are rezoned from neighborhood residential to something else, property taxes won't go up right away. Property taxes are based on what the county assessor thinks you'd be able to sell your property for. And so they base that on comparables, other houses that are of a similar size and a similar zoning. So in the short term, the property assessment won't change, but if they start to see properties in a similar area with a similar amount of, similar properties with similar rezones start to be going for more money, they might over time be worth, so if they look like the properties are worth more, then that assessment could go up. In terms of senior homeowners specifically, the King County has a property tax deferral program that actually allows senior homeowners to not pay property taxes and defer that, so they can stay in place. There is also a property tax exemption for low income homeowners as well. Will you be able to record next week's meeting to review before the 2012 deadline? Yes, we will plan on recording the next meeting and posting that online as well. We have another clarification about the thing, but it says it's a table, but it is not a table.
And I see this as, I don't have a name here, and that's fine. But our anonymous questioner, I would strongly encourage you, if you can, to join our office hours on Monday. I would love to have a conversation with you. We could get to the bottom of your. We could look at some documents together and better answer your question. Sorry about the frustration of this format for the kind of thing you're looking for. It sounds like it's pretty detailed.
Mm-hmm. Question about SEPA. It says, I understand SEPA is not required by the city for development for 2 years. Did Ecology approve this? So this was actually a state law that was approved by the Washington State Legislature that removed SEPA requirements for any housing development in the city. We still have to do it for other things, and we have to do it for all our projects. But yes, it was done by the state legislature. That actually goes till September of next year, and then we are proposing to put in place some new thresholds at that time, and that it will be also a piece of legislation that will come out in early 2025 as part of this package of things that we're putting forward to council. But there isn't a specific proposal for that yet, but the proposal will come out in early 2025.
We are just about at time here. I would say last call for questions. We will give it another 1 more minute here. If you have a question, there'll be other opportunities. The office hour Monday morning, another info session to replace the one that didn't work out quite so well. That'll be on Tuesday evening. And you can also just email us a question as well. That would be fine. But we'll give you another 30 seconds or so here. And thanks to all of you who did and had great questions and were out here. Again, sorry for the technical problems, and but thank you for sticking it out and being engaged and making the best of this evening. And here we go. Here's a question. This will probably take us to the finish line, I think. It's a long question.
So within 5 years, residential values doubled after HALA upzoning, which took us from SR2 to +3 for residential, but property taxes went up 3 to 4 times. Renters will have taxes passed through, and if property values double, renters will see naturally affordable units go up, and that will likely be passed on from landlords. I'm concerned naturally affordable will be first to be scraped and see big rental increases. So yes, property values and taxes did go up over the last 5 years. That was not really about the HALA upzoning. That was really about the overall market. I mean, again, that is what we're trying to work on. Property values have been going up hugely over the last 10 years or so. The price of a detached home has about doubled. That is one of the core purposes of this work, is to try and slow those price increases. So yeah, I think that's what we're trying to do, is try and increase the supply so that we do not see those spikes in home values that we've been seeing. Obviously, property taxes themselves are based on a lot of things. Assessed value is only one of them. Property taxes have gone up in a large part because we've passed a bunch of new levies, as well as new things, new changes at the state level as well. You may have already answered. Was there a seismic study for Queen Anne Hill for the property north of McGraw? So no, we did not do any new seismic studies as part of this work.
No, I think this question is saying that there was a seismic study.
Oh, there was a seismic study for the property north of McGill. I'm not aware of that specifically, but if you want to send it to us, we're happy to look at it.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to say goodnight to folks. Again, this is the opportunity to get your questions into us. We'll get you the information that you need to make an informed comment, which again, the stroke of midnight on December 20th. So that's coming up, but there's some time here to have a conversation back and forth and get you all what you need. And we really appreciate the attention and being involved in the process. So Brendan, thank you. Excellent job. Technical staff, thanks for flexing and making it work as well as we could.